If you grew up in the 90s, educational games were something you probably could not avoid. With the rise of video games at the time, and parents constantly advocating for educational entertainment for kids, there was no shortage of edutainment titles available for home game consoles, and especially PCs. Now, some companies, like the Learning Company for example, made brand new IPs specifically as educational franchises, a lot of which were quality products. And other companies, other companies, with the exception of the occasional first-party title, licensed out already established popular characters to use as the theme for various edutainment games, to very mixed levels of success. Mario was no stranger to this. I haven't looked it up, but I'm pretty sure Mario has had more educational games based on him than any other video game character, and if he isn't at the very top of the list, he's definitely close to it. So today, I decided to take a look back at all of the Mario-themed edutainment games that have come out over the years, and spoiler, this really wasn't as straightforward as I had initially assumed.
So normally what I do for videos like these is come up with some kind of criteria for the games to qualify for the topic I'm covering, and then come up with a way to organize them. Normally I go by year of release, but in this scenario, doing so is kind of difficult. I could theoretically track down every single release date and then talk about them in order, but not only are these release dates not only 100% recorded properly, but due to the amount of educational games that came out back to back, and oftentimes from the same developer, I think going strictly by order of release would have me bouncing around too much. So what I'm going to do here is start off with order of release for the one-off games, but then group some of the other titles together, depending on the history of their release, like, for example, games that exist within the same series. I know this is a little messy, but stay with me here, I promise, everything is going to work out. As far as the criteria for what counts, man, this one's murky too. You'd think educational Mario game would be a straightforward concept, but honestly, it's not that black and white, and I want to be thorough here, so I'll be addressing how certain games fit the video topic as I see fit. So without further ado, let's get into this. I told you it wasn't black and white. As I said just a minute ago, the first one we're going to take a look at today arguably may not technically fit the theme of the video, but I'm including it anyway as it is Mario adjacent, and Mario got his start as a character from the Donkey Kong series anyway, as well as being the main antagonist of Donkey Kong Jr. proper. Now, due to official release dates of games back in the 80s being a bit foggy, as these kinds of things weren't well documented, many sources say Donkey Kong Jr. Math released alongside the NES back in 1985, as one of the console's initial run of black box titles. That date can be disputed, and there's definitely been some talk about that date not being accurate, but because Nintendo themselves classify the game as a 1985 release, that's what I'm going with today. Not to mention, the game came out a couple years prior in Japan anyway. Donkey Kong Jr. Math, as I'm sure I don't need to explain to you, is a mathematics learning game which recycles the assets from the NES release of Donkey Kong Jr., using a kind of bastardized version of that game's mechanics to form a head-to-head math face-off. At least in the game's main modes, which are called Calculate A and Calculate B. These modes are technically the same, with the only difference being the difficulty, with Mode B using higher numbers. Basically, the setup here is that Big Daddy DK sits at the top of the screen holding up a specific number, and the goal is to reach that sum using the mathematical operators and numbers strewn across various vines as fast as possible. Or at least that would be the goal if you actually play with another person. The game claims it's 1 and 2 player, but there's no option to compete against the CPU. Without an opponent to face off against, player 2 just stands there and there's no reason to rush and there's no penalty for taking your sweet ass time or making mistakes. I guess I could see how this might be helpful for teaching math, but with no challenge involved, there's no real incentive to avoid mistakes. Once you win 4 rounds, you get a little victory jingle and the game just resets. That's it. No other stages, no nothing. You'd think since the Donkey Kong games are known for having multiple stages, this one would at least do another asset flip for some stage variation, but nope, that's all she wrote. There is one more mode though called Operator Exercise that is actually 1 player, which is weird considering it's option 3 on the menu and for all intents and purposes sounds like a practice mode. This one at least uses the assets from the final stage of Donkey Kong Jr., so there is 1 instance of stage variation in this mode. When you select the mode, the game then lets you choose which type of problems you'd like to solve, with various options for different operators and number of digits, which range from Baby Einstein to Literal Einstein. Once you select a format, the game gives you 10 problems you need to solve in succession. The controls are pretty weird and unintuitive, and it actually did take me a few minutes to figure out just what the f I was supposed to be doing. Each chain on the screen correlates with a slot in the sum for the problem you need to solve, and as you ascend up the chain, the number increases. When you reach the correct number, you then move to the next chain to set the selected number, and repeat for each slot. There is an option to see the answer though and skip the problem by pushing the key all the way up the chain at the far left of the screen. That's about it for this game though. It's about as bare bones as you can get. I really think they should have at least included a true one-player option where you can face off against a CPU, because as it stands, it's pretty useless without someone else to play with. This game is actually the most rare black box NES game and is notoriously known among collectors for being specifically extraordinarily rare and expensive to find a complete in-box copy, which I can only assume is because nobody bought it because it sucks. Alright, so this one's a little bit of a stretch too. It isn't something I'd really consider educational myself per se, but it literally has the word teacher in the title. Many people do include it in the conversation when it comes to Mario edutainment games, so I'd be remiss not to include it. This is one of the few games that I'll be talking about today that I can't really play, or at least if I were to play it, I couldn't actually get the intended experience out of it. It's called I Am a Teacher, Super Mario Sweater. And it was less of a game and more of a tool that was released for the Famicom Disk System exclusively in Japan back in 1986. The brainchild of a Japanese appliance and sewing company called Royal Industries, it was essentially a tool where you could create your own Mario-themed sweater. Weirdly enough, this is also not the last time the sewing world and the video game world would collide. Now, I can't read Japanese, so I don't know what any of these options actually are individually, but they're basically different measurements and specifications for creating a sweater tailored to fit you, or I guess whoever you may be making a sweater for. Now, I can only really get so much information from watching footage or fumbling around menus myself, but basically what we have here is a tool that lets you custom design a sweater with a bunch of different Mario-themed templates. It's really a stretch to call this a learning game, but I guess at the very least it teaches kids about measurements, so math, I guess. The real feature here, though, is the fact that you don't just design the sweater, you design a sweater which you could then actually own. Royal had a system put in place for the game where after you finished your design, you can then mail in all the dimensions and designs, and for honestly a relatively small fee at the time, they would custom make your sweater for you. I know nowadays this may seem super out there, but in the days of throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what would stick in the gaming industry, I think this is kind of cool. And being able to actually design something that could then be brought to life seems like a really cool novelty. It's one thing to be able to create something within a piece of software, but it's another to be able to make said thing tangible. All things considered, from what I can tell, this seems like it was pretty cool. It's a shame it never came to the US. Hey, real quick, I know you guys probably hate hearing this, but if you like what you're seeing and you want to see more, consider subscribing. It really does help me out a lot, and I would really appreciate it. So, with that out of the way, let's get back to the video. With similar energy to the game we just talked about, we have yet another Mario-themed creation tool. Once again, not exactly the textbook definition of educational game, but I think in these instances, letting kids learn to be creative is valid. This time with something called Super Mario Bros. Print World, which if I had to describe it to people who were alive at the time, it looked to be something akin to a Mario-themed version of the print shop. Since I'm sure most people watching this video have no idea what the print shop was, let me explain. Super Mario Bros. Print World was a publishing tool that let you create cards, banners, signs, posters, calendars, and more. As I'm sure is already apparent, it was a PC game that you could link up to your printer, create things, and then print them out. To quote the back of the box, Mario, Luigi, and the rest of the Super Mario Bros. Gang take center stage in this powerful print program that lets you express your creativity in a fun and easy way. Create a Merry Mario banner for a friend's homecoming, design a Koopa card for that loved one, or make a mushroom mask just for fun. You can even write and illustrate your own storybook starring the beautiful princess, then print it out for hours of coloring fun. The possibilities are endless with Super Mario Bros. Print World. Signs, stationery, cards, posters, and banners are only the beginning. You can also print out puppets, bookmarks, masks, and lots more for hours of creative fun. Basically, it came with a bunch of assets and elements from Super Mario Bros. 3 and Super Mario Land. You slap them onto a bunch of different templates and you print them out to your heart's content. Go crazy. There's also some stuff from Dr. Mario and, weirdly enough, King Koopa from the Super Mario Bros. Super Show. There's not much more to be said about this. What you see here is what you get. This was a cool little tool that was a relatively cheap piece of software that kids could use to create some stuff that I'm sure a lot of them were probably excited to use. It's simple, but facilitating creativity early on is important, so I bag it, I guess. Keeping this theme going here, we have Super Mario Bros. And Friends When I Grow Up. It's It's really nothing more than a digital coloring book. Another PC game, it features illustrations by Rick and Croce, whoever that is, which you can color in and then subsequently print out. It features different scenes of Mario, Luigi, Peach, Toad, Bowser, and even a cameo of Link, among various other characters, all doing, well, a bunch of mundane real-world shit. What I'm guessing is, judging by the title, this game features Mario characters and a bunch of careers one can have when they grow up. Glad to see once Link is too old to save Hyrule, he has a brilliant future as a travel agent ahead of him. Now, there really isn't much you can do here. You can't alter the image in any way outside of just coloring things in, and the base color template is pretty limited. You do, however, have an option to mix colors together, and when doing so, it brings the total color options from a lackluster 16 all the way up to 256. So it's pretty limited off the shelf, but does have some options for those wanting more. Unfortunately, though, the only option for actually coloring is basically the paint bucket tool. You can only fill in entire chunks with no options for manually coloring or drawing. Further supporting the fact that this is more about teaching kids about possible career paths than it is about coloring, clicking on the name of each occupation brings up a pretty in-depth breakdown of each occupation. I'd say it's a little sneaky that this is essentially a piece of software that's softly saying, "Hey kid, eventually you gotta get a fucking job," disguised as a cute coloring book, but I do have to say, this one probably qualifies as a learning game more so than the last few, despite the sheer lack of content involved. It's pretty bare bones, but it definitely is trying to teach something, and that something is capitalism. Back in the early 90s, home computers were nowhere even remotely near as prevalent as they would soon grow to become. They were still pretty damn expensive, and a luxury not everyone had. Nintendo, taking note of this and also in an effort to appease many parents advocating for more educational games, came up with Mario Paint, a piece of software for the Super Nintendo for art, music, and animation that was something much more closely resembling a home computer program as opposed to something like Super Mario World, and even went as far as to create a mouse for use with it, which was packed in with every copy along with a mousepad. In hindsight now, Mario Paint might not immediately come off as an educational game, but at the time it was geared towards kids who really never used something like it before, and it had a lot of options that could essentially be figured out just by futzing around the GUI, as it wasn't marketed towards experienced artists, but rather for kids just learning to explore their creativity. And it was a great tool at the time for facilitating that. There's also something to be said about the fact that it's just a cartridge that you slap in your Super Nintendo. Unlike installing and launching PC software, getting Mario Paint up and running was something even a young kid can understand, and didn't require the same amount of adult supervision and assistance to play. It's obviously not the most advanced piece of software, but though there is a ton of limitation in its usability, it does have quite the Swiss Army knife of options. Due to this, over the years we've seen insane creations that have come from this game. Not due to it being some amazing creation tool, but rather due to its inherent limitation. Now, I couldn't possibly go into all the options that are available in the game, but the main things Mario Paint has to offer are the free drawing tool, the music creation tool, the animation tool, and of course, the fly swatter game, which was admittedly a strange inclusion, but adds to the quirkiness of it all. The free paint tool is pretty self-explanatory. It's akin to something like MS Paint, but with some quirky options you'd expect of a game that's undo tool is a dog's face. And if you somehow didn't know where the undo dog from Mario Maker came from, that'd be him. You have your standard different brush sizes, an airbrush tool, paint bucket tool, but then some more in-depth options like the stamp editor, where you can go pixel by pixel and create a stamp that can then be used on the main paint screen. There's even a coloring book option for templates if you'd just like to color pre-drawn scenes. The animation tool is pretty unique, as I don't really remember any easily accessible software from back then that was capable of creating simple animations. I don't personally know how to use it because I'm an adult that doesn't have that kind of time and patience as I did when I was 5, but it's simple enough that a kid who messes around with it long enough can manage to figure it out. And you can even set your animation to music you create in the music editor. Mario Paint's music editor was undoubtedly many a chiptune artist's first exposure to music creation. And it actually has a few options I was surprised to see here, like the changing of tempo and time signature. As for the sounds, you can choose from a bunch of different instruments which are comprised of different sounds, ranging from something actually musical like MIDI guitar, or a sound effect from another familiar game, like the Yoshi sound, for example. Alongside the many different creation tools Mario Paint had to offer, the game also had this strange fly swatter minigame. I guess it was included just as a fun side thing when you want to take a break from creating, but much like the weird minigames from the Game Boy camera, the Fly Swatter game is a weird little arcade-style game with 3 looping stages. It's hard to explain what genre I'd call it, but it's like if you combined a shoot-'em-up with whack-a-mole. It's a fun little distraction, but it gets old fast. The title screen itself even has some weird little interactive things to do in it. Mario Paint has a lot of charm, and even today I think it's a great little game for kids who are just starting to get creative. Sure, there's much more advanced softwares and apps that do a million different things now, but I think there's brilliance in the simplicity Mario Paint has to offer. I definitely think there's still value in something like this, and maybe it's a good alternative option if you want to avoid iPad babysitting. If you really want to get into Mario Paint, and I mean really get into Mario Paint, there's even an officially licensed guide with an insane amount of tips and ideas for people who want to excel past the baby bullshit and get to create in some real works of art. It's really more of an extensive manual than it is some kind of strategy guide. It goes incredibly in-depth and really breaks down all the little intricacies and teaches you how to really harness what Mario Paint is really capable of. And it has a lot of sheet music that you can recreate in-game if music creation isn't your thing, but you still want more music options. Hell, recreating those songs and then altering them can even be a way to get your foot in the door for original music creation. Mario Paint is great, and its influence over kids in 1992 can still be seen today. Its reputation absolutely precedes itself, and it really does have an identity of its own that's completely separate from the mainline Mario games, and that identity can often be seen sprinkled throughout gaming culture today. If you weren't already familiar with the game, you probably heard about a million YouTube videos that use the music in the background and didn't even realize it. I think it's pretty safe to say that whenever someone mentions Mario edutainment games, one of, if not the first game that comes to mind for most people who grew up in the 90s is Mario Teaches Typing. Released for MS-DOS back in 1992, and then updated for Windows in 1994, Mario Teaches Typing was a lot of kids' first introduction to typing back then, including myself. This is a game I happen to have a lot of history with, being one of the first games I ever played on a computer, along with other of its 90s learning game contemporaries. Now, the Windows version has this terrifying disembodied Mario head that talks to you via the main menu, but the MS-DOS version that I grew up with was luckily less nightmare-inducing, with a simple Mario sprite instead. That being said, the weird creepy talking Mario head is actually pretty significant, as Mario Teaches Typing is the first video game with Charles Martinet's voice appearing to voice the character. Prior to this game's release, he also voiced the character for something called Mario in Real Time, a trade show experience in which Martinet, as well as another voice actor named Stevie Coyle, would strap on this big dumbass-looking movement-tracking helmet and hiding somewhere as they recited various lines to event-goers via a TV screen with Mario's floating head on the screen. This technique was then later used in the Windows release of Mario Teaches Typing. That's not the version I grew up with, though, so I just got Aldi brand Mario.
Mario Teaches Typing!
The Windows version introduced cutscenes, actually giving the game a simple storyline, which was absent in the initial release. So Mario and Luigi walk up to a castle that has teeth, and there's a floating typewriter outside, for some reason. Despite walking up to it with cracked knuckles and full confidence, though, Mario can't seem to figure out how to type, and it looks as though he's just slapping his hands across the keyboard. It then spontaneously combusts and leaves a note behind that just says, "Find me." I'm not sure what anything that happens in this cutscene is trying to say. It all just kind of happens and we have no context, so I'm not sure what our motivation is, but I guess we need to find a floating sentient typewriter. So there's a few stages here, each with a different typing lesson theme. The first is a bit annoying because it's about home row keys, and honestly, I don't know anybody who actually rests their fingers at home row keys, and it's also just a really slow stage in general. It's not until after that first pretty boring stage that the game gets a little more enjoyable, but I am using the word enjoyable very, very loosely. The following two stages require you to type different strings of text. One where you're swimming away from a giant fish and typing the words correctly makes you swim faster, combining typing words and capital letters where applicable, and another where you need to type complete sentences to make your way through Bowser's castle. There's also a practice mode where you can freely practice your typing skills without it impacting progression or score. Much like a lot of licensed educational games, despite being called Mario Teaches Typing, the game doesn't really actually teach you typing as much as it just kind of gives you a space to practice typing, which I guess is still something to give it credit for. Sure, at its core, it's just a mundane typing practice game, but speaking from experience, having that Mario coat of paint at least makes it seem like it's more than just a mundane typing practice game. As a kid, even with licensed off-model Mario, playing games like these with familiar characters and bright colors did motivate me to interact with them way more than if they were just black and white text on a screen. Like I said, this game doesn't really do a great job of teaching anything per se, but I do think motivating kids to actually practice their typing skills is something the game succeeded at doing. I know I spent a lot of time practicing my typing because of this game alone, and I'm sure a lot of other people who grew up around the time the game came out can say the same. The one thing I will hold against it, though, is that it just lacks content in general. There are multiple playable characters, but it doesn't do anything to impact how the game plays at all, and besides that one extra practice mode, there's only 3 stages here. So despite being a good practice tool, you're kind of just stuck replaying the same few stages over and over again. Obviously, you can increase your speed and precision and clear the stages faster with less mistakes, but there's just not much to look at here. The aesthetic is really the main thing this game has going for it, and I feel like there should have at least been a couple more stages with familiar Mario locales. Like even the underground aesthetic, for example, and maybe a couple more lesson types along with it. Despite it being kind of easy to poke fun at, I actually think Mario Teaches Typing is one of the better examples of a licensed educational game. It lacks content, but I do think it succeeded at what it was trying to do. Now, there was a game that released some years later in 1997 under the title Mario Teaches Typing 2, but details surrounding the release of this game are kind of murky. See, Mario Teaches Typing 2, as far as I can tell, is literally just another release, sort of a deluxe release of Mario Teaches Typing. As far as I can tell, the talking floating Mario head was initially included in the 1994 CD-ROM release, but I'm seeing conflicting information about Mario Teaches Typing 2 being the first to include it. This doesn't really add up to me though, as 1996 is a pretty long time in the future after the 1992 Mario in Real-Time exhibits. From what I can gather though, Mario Teaches Typing 2 seems to be just a re-release with some new music, extra animation, some newly drawn menus, a new typewriter mode with an on-screen keyboard, and from the info I've found, customizable lesson plans, I think. Mario Teaches Typing 2 is also significant as it marks the very last licensed educational Mario game to be released, as the sea of poor quality content that had come from licensing out the Mario name for educational purposes was vast and started to take a toll on Nintendo, with Shigeru Miyamoto apparently telling the CEO at the time of Interplay, the developers of Mario Teaches Typing, that they would no longer allow the Mario IP to be used for educational games. Let me give you a little backstory about the history I've had with Mario is Missing. I'm very much sure this story isn't an exclusive experience, but nevertheless, Mario is Missing is one of the games my parents picked up for me when I was a kid. We had just recently gotten a PC at the time, and I had no idea there were Mario games for computers at all. I got it home, booted it up, and immediately had no idea what I was doing. Nothing made sense to me. I did figure out soon after that it was an educational game about geography, but going into it blind, there's really no way I could have known. I'm gonna be honest, until making this video, I still had no idea how you were even supposed to play it. Despite trying tons of times when I was a kid, this game is completely unintuitive, and it wasn't until now, looking up a guide to break myself into it, that I managed to actually get into the meat of the game. This time around, I checked out the SNES version, just for accessibility purposes, and it's the version I never played before. Well, that and the NES version, which I did briefly check out, but there's not much reason to go in depth about it. I don't think it's worth it to talk extensively about, but just to go over it real quickly, it's set up just like the SNES version for the most part, except like 1,000 times more cumbersome because there's less buttons to work with and no pause menu, so everything takes like 40 extra steps for no reason, but I digress, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself. So Mario is Missing starts out with Mario falling through a trapdoor in front of Bowser's castle, which, according to the plot of the game, has now been moved from the Mushroom Kingdom to Antarctica. There's actually a whole wacky plot about Bowser stealing artifacts from different places around the world, but literally none of it is explained in-game, and all we get is the Mario trapdoor thing. Anyway, now it's Luigi's job to go through each area, finding and returning the various artifacts to find and save Mario. So think of this as the prequel to Luigi's Mansion. Basically, what you need to do is enter any of the doors to go into a different city in the world, and then walk around the map defeating Koopas scattered throughout. Some of them drop an artifact upon death, and then you need to return said artifact to one of 3 kiosks on the map where Peach is hanging out for some reason. When you try to do that, though, she'll ask you some questions to prove you know certain things about the stolen artifact you literally are trying to return. And if you get the questions wrong, she rejects your offer. All right. She also won't let you try again until you speak with another NPC, which, like, I get they were trying to make it so you can't just cheat through trial and error, but it's kind of arbitrary and stupid since sometimes you can engage an NPC on the same screen and other times you need to walk super far to find somebody else just so you can engage with them and then walk your ass back to Peach's kiosk. The answer to each Peach's questions, though, are given to you via the other Peach kiosks. If you talk to one of them, they'll give you a pamphlet about some kind of monument or point of interest, and it's your job to study said pamphlet so that you can remember the answers that apply to whatever kiosk requires them. Or, since it's 2022, you can just Google the answers. reminding me a lot of when I was a kid and teachers used to tell me I couldn't use a calculator for math because I'm not gonna have a calculator in my pocket all the time. Joke's on them. I now have a device in my pocket that can answer any question I have about anything at all times, and I'm still bad at math. Checkmate, math teachers. Anyway, the only other thing you need to do is figure out where exactly it is that you currently are. What you're supposed to do is walk around talking to NPCs and use their clues to figure out which city you're in, but to be honest, if you're an adult with a functioning brain, there's a pretty good chance you'll never need to talk to anybody. Like, I don't really think I need to phone a friend to know I'm in f***ing Russia. Once you figure it out, you can go to this giant Mario World version of a real-world map and direct Yoshi to wherever you think you currently are. Although actually knowing the answer doesn't really matter, because you could just trial and error your way across the entire map until you get the answer right with no penalty. Get it right, and you get to ride Yoshi. Not only is Yoshi faster, meaning you should probably do this as soon as possible to cut down time walking around the stages, but you also need Yoshi to complete the level, as a Pokey spawns in the pipe you entered the level in, and you can only go back through the pipe once Yoshi scares the Pokey away. After you complete all the stages on each respective floor of the castle, you fight one of the Koopalings in honestly an extremely frustrating version of a regular Mario-esque fight. All you need to do is jump on their heads, like in Mario 3 or Mario World, but they play a pretty annoying game of keep away, so surprisingly, your reflexes need to kind of be on point here, at least to do damage. You don't really need to do anything else to avoid attacks because you literally can't get hurt, but I highly doubt I'd have had the dexterity to land attacks when I was a kid. You rinse and repeat this process for, at least in the SNES version, 3 floors. The MS-DOS version actually has 5, greatly increasing the overall length of the game, and the NES version has 7, albeit with only 2 stages per floor, coming in at 1 stage less than the SNES version. Once you defeat all the Koopalings, you beat the game. That's it. There is an end sequence where Bowser gets shot out of a fucking cannon, but there's no actual Bowser boss fight here. I'm sure some kids who played this game might have passively learned some things from this game, but I have a feeling most kids would just try to strong-arm their way through it with trial and error, trying to learn as little as possible. That being said, needing to answer the various questions correctly to advance in the game does passively teach you something, and I guess there's something to be said for that. Or some kids may have just been like me and wandered around aimlessly until they got frustrated about the fact that they couldn't figure out how to progress. If nothing else, at least this game gave us Ouija. Much like Mario's Missing, Mario's Time Machine shares the exact same space in my brain. Released not too long after Mario's Missing, and following a very similar model, Mario's Time Machine is another game released by the software Toolworks, who were not only responsible for the previous game, but whose name is going to linger around for a bit for the next few chunks of this video. Like in the case of Mario's Missing, Mario's Time Machine sends you to different cities around the world to return various artifacts that were stolen by Bowser. Only this time around, it's based more on the history aspect, seeing Mario go back in time to different time periods. It's honestly not much different in concept to Mario's Missing. I know Mario is Missing was supposed to be geography-based, and this game is supposed to be history-based, but the two concepts kind of blend together and you're left with a very similar product, since the main goals of both is returning artifacts stolen by Bowser to different places by answering a bunch of specific historical questions. In this case, I'd say Mario's Time Machine actually does a better job at nailing down its subject. I don't want to harp on Mario is Missing too much, but it's hard not to talk about the parallels between the two. At least this game doesn't have you wandering around giant maps, opting instead to have each main stage consist of single screens with multiple doors where you can interact with NPCs. Much like the previous game, this is yet another one I tried to play on PC as a kid, and for the life of me, I couldn't figure out how to play it. Basically, you enter Bowser's castle, and each of the 3 floors, in the SNES version anyway, houses 5 artifacts. You pick up one of the artifacts, and then press the R button to bring up a document with a story about whatever item you currently hold, but with a bunch of blank spaces. You then press the L button to bring up the time machine, and use the location and date that were on the document to travel to said place and time. Before being sent there, though, you need to play this mini-game where Mario is on a surfboard or something. The goal is to collect 10 mushrooms, and then enter these warp zone whirlpool things or whatever. Entering one of them without collecting 10 mushrooms fails the minigame and you're sent back to the castle. Beat it though, and you're transported to the time and date you selected. Once there, you basically just have to enter random doors and talk to various NPCs to gather information. This is where you'll find the answers you'll need to punch in on the blank spaces from earlier. There's one room per stage where a historical figure resides, and that's where you return the artifact. But much like in Mario is Missing, can't return it until after you prove yourself or whatever. Bring up the document with the R button again, and you go down the line filling in all the blanks. This takes a lot of memorization, or ideally taking down notes so you don't forget and need to go back and talk to NPCs again, is what I would say. If, once again, it were not 2022, so do what the smart people do and just Google the answers instead of wasting your time arbitrarily interacting with a bunch of NPCs. After the document is complete, make your way through whichever door had the historical figure behind it and return the artifact. Then all you need to do is press the L button again to bring up a gigantic creepy Mario hand to end the level. Unlike Mario is Missing, this game doesn't have any boss fights, and once again, once you've finished the 3 floors of the castle, you just kind of win the game. No Bowser fight. Also, Bowser does straight up f***ing die. There really is not much to this game at all. I feel like overall it probably does a little bit better of a job at teaching, maybe, but also I feel like they definitely cut corners with this one in terms of content. It does seem rushed, but at the same time, Mario is Missing seemed like it was full of padding with the giant maps where every screen looks identical. I'm not sure why they couldn't find a happy medium here, but I will say Mario's Time Machine does kind of feel like Mario is Missing light. At its core, it's essentially the same exact concept and same exact execution, with just all the fat trimmed off. Once again, this game too had an NES version, only this time, from what I've played, the NES version is completely different. The story is roughly the same, with the only real difference being Bowser kidnapping Yoshi, but in terms of the gameplay, this game is actually more platforming focused, weirdly enough. I didn't even mention this before, but like, you can jump in the SNES version, but there's literally nowhere in the entire game where you would ever need to jump for any reason. The NES version, though, has straight up platforming based stages with enemies and blocks to hit, which gives you various pieces of historical information, kind of like how the NPCs do. Only this involves what is arguably action-based gameplay. Also in the NES version, the artifacts don't just sit atop random pedestals, and you actually need to play a version of the old-school Mario Bros. Arcade game to retrieve them. After that, though, I could not for the life of me figure this one out. But once I acquired the artifact, I had no idea where or how I was supposed to return it. You can select different dates to warp to via this time machine warp pipe thing, but once you're there, there's no NPCs like in the SNES version, so I don't know what the f*** I'm supposed to do with this egg. I'm sure if I spent enough time with it, I'd figure it out, but if I took a deep dive into every single version of every one of these games, we'd be here forever. Just know, as far as I can tell, despite being janky, I think the NES version might have more to offer as far as being a video game. So as I said in the previous section, the Software Toolworks is a name that's not gonna be going away for a little while in this video. They not only made what is for all intents and purposes sister games with Mario is Missing and Mario's Time Machine, but additionally made a series called Mario's Early Years, the first of which is called Mario's Early Years Fun with Letters. Much like the previous 2 games, there was an SNES as well as a PC release, and once again, we're going to be looking at the Super Nintendo version here. Now, this is another game I have some history with, only this time, it's not from my childhood. Mario's Early Years Fun with Letters is one of the first games I ever covered on my channel back when I was just starting out. Never thought this game was one I'd be going back to, but here we are. Now, it should go without saying, but this is a spelling and reading comprehension game for kids around the kindergarten/first grade range. It's essentially a minigame compilation, but the execution of it all is just extremely bizarre. Like, the variation in pixel art direction, for example, which can most notably be seen in the fact that they redrew Luigi 3 different times in the same sleeping position, and they all look wildly different. There's 7 minigames in total, or I should say 6, because one of the islands you can select on the main map literally just brings you to an area where a small child recites the alphabet to you. Weirdly, sometimes combining an alliterative adjective in conjunction with whatever picture is currently on screen that correlates to whichever letter you're currently up to. For example, Luigi is just Luigi, but the fish is funny fish. And I did mention this in my old video, but it's been 7 years and I'm still wondering exactly what the f is supposed to be so funny about this goldfish. Now, all the main minigames just involve selecting the correct words or letters based on different criteria depending on the game. There's a puzzle one, which is not a puzzle at all. I'm really not sure why they decided to use puzzle pieces in the minigame because you aren't actually solving a puzzle. You just need to select the correct letters based on the sound the instructional child makes, which, by the way, you wouldn't know you were supposed to do unless you randomly clicked on the sleeping Luigi. The minigame actually doesn't start and you have no direction until you do that, which the game does not convey to you at all. The rest of the minigames are more self-explanatory. They're immediately easy to figure out, like a complete the sentence game.
The princess has a big cup.
One where you need to select the words on the screen that start with a specific letter, another where you need to do the same but only with pictures, one where you select the words that end in a specific letter, and one more that, unless I'm losing my mind, I swear to God, is exactly the same as the other minigame. Despite it being immediately obvious what to do, you'd be making a mistake by not waking up Luigi, because as it turns out, these minigames don't actually start until you do that. Even though the game lets you play them beforehand, so you can actually just endlessly answer the same correct questions over and over again without progressing, and the game doesn't count it as a win unless you click on Luigi. Only then will the game reward you with a win screen and progress you to the next stage. Not that it matters anyway though, since you literally don't need to do any of this and can just walk through every warp pipe to the next level anyway in every single minigame. And with all that being said, ultimately none of this matters at all. Get all the answers wrong and skip levels all you want because you can't actually beat the game. So Mario's early years Fun with Letters doesn't actually keep track of any minigame you've beaten, and once you complete all of them, nothing happens. You just get sent right back to the map screen. That's it. No, you did it. No, congratulations. No, nothing. Look, this game is probably fine for an interactive Mario-themed version of flashcards for studying, but as far as being a game, this isn't a game. It's digital flashcards and nothing more. Without giving kids some kind of incentive, like unlocking stages, or at the bare minimum a f***ing congratulations screen, just some kind of goal to work towards, it's impossible to feel like you've achieved anything when playing something like this. And this is where a lot of these educational games fail. Like, cool, you've made an educational program and then inserted Mario, but you didn't do anything to replicate the satisfaction that comes with playing a Mario game, or a video game at all. How Long to Beat says this game takes 31 minutes to complete, and I say that's a fucking lie, because you can actually beat this game. No, you're not seeing things, and the video did not somehow rewind on its own. This is in fact a different game. The Software Toolworks' second release in the Mario's Early Years series obviously shows that these games are all based on the same basic skeleton. This time around, though, you can tell this game was probably started being worked on after the Letters one was already in development, as Mario's Early Years Fun with Numbers has slightly more polish in certain areas, at least when it comes to little things like animations, although they, for some reason, couldn't be to come up with a different title screen. Apart from that though, this game is essentially set up identically from the previous. You enter a big world map with 7 different minigame worlds to choose from, all containing mostly the same type of stuff you saw in Fun with Letters. This time around though, I feel like they definitely ran out of ideas of what to do, even more so than in Fun with Letters. See, when they said Fun with Numbers, they literally just meant numbers. Like, not math, numbers. Never once does a minigame include solving any kind of mathematical equations, and instead the game is just kind of filled with number recognition games. Like the previous game, it does have a starting world that isn't really a game, but more of a study session where the game helps you grasp the concept of numbers. The first world actually has 2 areas this time around, which are selectable from a secondary world map. The first being Mario's room, where you move the cursor around clicking on different objects, which the game then counts for you. For example, if you click on one of Mario's cavalcade of shoes on the ground, the game proceeds to count them.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 shoes.
That's not right. There's 10 shoes on the ground there, champ. Oh wait, this game lets you click on those shoes separately?
1, 2, 3, 4.
No, God!
There's another area where you do the same thing, but in Mario's kitchen this time, where Mario keeps 4 unwrapped ice pops in his freezer, his 5 plates far too high up for him to conceivably reach, his grandma's urn on the counter, and his 3 cups, which he stores in the bottom cabinet like a f***ing serial killer. Given the fact that this game never touches on actual math, it's probably unsurprising then to find out that a lot of these minigames actually have nothing to do with numbers at all. The one outlier here is the fact that a couple of these minigames are about shape and size recognition, which is technically geometry, but some of the minigames are literally stuff like find the doll in the tree, stuff that has absolutely 100% nothing to do with numbers, much less having fun with said numbers. Again, just like in the first, the minigames don't actually start until you click on Luigi, and you can also just skip levels all willy-nilly with no consequence. You know, I really can't get over how this game is called Fun with Numbers, but it's packed to the brim with minigames like this where you need to select specific objects, none of which have anything to do with numbers. This entire minigame is about selecting which bucket is filled with sand, which is filled with water. The game asks you to select the shovel. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm failing to see what any of this has to do with numbers. Literally at all. It's like they needed a number game to pair with the letters game, but then realized numbers as a concept wasn't enough to base an entire learning game off of. Had the other game been Mario's Early Years, Fun with Reading, this one could have been Fun with Math, and they easily would have had more to work with. But in this case, I really can't think of another reason for any of this nonsense other than that they had to have been grasping at straws to this thing out. I try really hard not to call stuff like this a cash grab, but it's really impossible to see it as anything else. The previous game was by no means good, and I wouldn't say it particularly succeeded in being an educational game that's based on educating, but at least Fun with Letters stayed on subject. This thing just seems like a failed attempt to follow up to the first game by any means necessary, and then scraping the bottom of the barrel looking for things to actually flesh it out into something with the runtime of the first. I can't imagine where they could have possibly gone from here because there's one more game left in the Mario's Early Years series. Can't wait. No, you're not seeing things and the video did not somehow rewind on its own? Again? Well, the Software Toolworks pulled their shenanigans one last time with the final entry in the trilogy, Mario's Early Years Preschool Fun. Now, you may be wondering, if the first game was about letters and the second was about numbers, what could Preschool Fun possibly entail? I shit you not, this is literally just a lesser version of Fun with Numbers. Remember how I said that a lot of Fun with Numbers was scraping the bottom of the barrel for content and that most of the game actually wasn't about numbers at all? Well, a lot of the subjects of those minigames have been repurposed for this one. Only difference is that in the context of this game, it actually makes a lot more sense, since instead of being subject-based, this is supposed to be just a general preschool learning game. There's counting, shape recognition, finding opposites. It's a lot of listening to very specific commands and selecting answers based on them. I think it does more in terms of practicing problem solving than anything, but the problem with this one is that there's barely any content in it at all. And that's compared to 2 games that came before it that barely had any content at all. Just like the first 2 games, it's set up exactly the same with the multiple worlds selectable from a main menu map, but this time there's only 6 worlds instead of 7. And you might think maybe that means the minigames are longer, but nope. Those are much shorter too, and the game still has that throwaway world that doesn't actually have a minigame in it. This time around, it's yet another area where the game will count groups of things that you click on, and instead of having 2 areas of this game only has the 1 screen. Oh, and did I say it has a throwaway world? Because what I should have said was that it actually has 2 of them. They padded out the world map with not 1, but 2 pointless islands that aren't even minigames. The second one actually is probably the most ridiculous usage of a world in all 3 games. It's called Body World, and it's just 1 screen where I swear to God you can only click on like 4 things, and all it does is make Mario like wiggle his nose and shit. Nothing gives kids a head start on schooling like pixelated monkeys waving. Besides once again sprinkling in a little extra animation flair here and there, and at the very least having some art exclusive to this game, this has to be the laziest effort to slap together something they could sell as yet another game in the series that they could have possibly done. Honestly, all 3 of these could have just been released as 1 game. They came up with a skeleton for Mario's Early Years format and then just stretched it as far as it would go. Honestly, They stretched it way further than it could go because they were obviously already running out of ideas by the second game. The fact that this game is literally like half as long as the other two and has close to no content in it is ridiculous. This is a cash grab if I've ever seen one. I know a lot of times people call game developers lazy, and it's usually uninformed and unwarranted, but it's hard to argue that this is anything other than that. Maybe not for the people whose hands literally programmed it, but sure as hell from whatever higher up made the call. This is a trilogy of games that should have stopped after the first. The first two games should have just been combined and they should have called it a day. Instead, we have these weird sister games that so closely share assets that it's of Pokemon version magnitude, but unlike in the case of Pokemon, these are played off as completely different entries in a series as opposed to two sides of the same coin. And then to make matters worse, they topped it all off with this last final slap in the face that's devoid of content and doesn't even have a focus. And I don't think I really have a way of finding out, but I can only assume they were all sold at the same price at launch. Take advantage of parents' ignorance, and the kids suffer for it. God bless. Okay, we have yet another one where, God, this is really a stretch to call this an educational game, but I do want to be thorough. Apparently, people do include this in lists of educational Mario games. It was made by the same company that made Mario Teaches Typing. The front of the box clearly calls itself a learning game, and frankly, its legacy is iconic, if only for this one line.
I'ma go fishing.
Mario's Game Gallery, also released as Mario's Fundamentals, so I don't know what to call it. Call it what you want. I'm calling it Mario's Game Gallery for this one, I guess, but it doesn't matter. Its claim is that it teaches fundamental learning skills, but it's basically a collection of a few different common games, all with a Mario theme, in which you play against Mario himself. There's checkers, Go Fish, dominoes, backgammon, and Yahtzee, which in this game is listed on the menu as Yacht, which I assume is probably due to copyright reasons. From what I've heard, the CPU opponent in these games are pretty cheap, and the whole novelty of the thing kind of wears off pretty fast. Sure, it's neat playing checkers against an interactive Mario with Koopas and Yoshis as the game pieces. I would have liked it when I was a kid, but there's a reason this game wasn't reviewed very favorably when it came out. Initially, reception was relatively fine, with various publications praising it for being a decent educational and family-oriented game, but later on it was smeared along with other third-party published Mario spin-offs by critics who claimed that the slew of games produced without the supervision of Nintendo were almost responsible for destroying the Mario brand. This is probably one of the reasons Nintendo so closely guards their IPs now, but in the case of Mario's Game Gallery, I feel like there's far more egregious examples. This one's a stretch too, but whatever. I didn't even know it existed, and it wouldn't be a journey if I wasn't being as thorough as possible, and so I present to you Mario Calculator, a DSiWare Mario-themed calculator. I shouldn't really need to explain why this technically qualifies as educational. Also released on the same day was Mario Clock, and I'm sure you can figure out what that one is. Mario Calculator has two modes: Calculator, obviously, and Unit Converter. The game starts off in Calculator mode when you boot it up, with Mario in an area based on the underground levels from Super Mario Bros. For the NES. Using the D-pad and buttons can move Mario around and jump, but this doesn't really do much. The calculator has pretty basic functions, nothing too deep. It's not like a graphing calculator or anything, but the available functions are addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and percentage, with max digits capping out at 13. Unit Converter mode, though, features Luigi, and there's two ways of entering said mode. Tapping the button switches the mode outright, but it can also be accessed by walking through the warp pipe, which is kind of weird because Mario enters and then Luigi exits. Wow, that means this really is Green Mario. Unit Converter mode is actually pretty neat because besides just converting typical units of measurement like length, weight, volume, or time, it also has other things you wouldn't typically expect, like age conversion from human years to dog or hamster years. I'm willing to bet not many people really spent too much time with this one, but it's a cool little novelty, especially since it came out back in 2009, a time where not everybody had a smartphone yet. It was even later made available for the 3DS in 2011. Unfortunately, with the recent discontinuation of the 3DS eShop, this little piece of software isn't as easily accessible as it once was, despite being on a console most people still own. But If you for some reason feel compelled to check this one out, like you really gotta try out Mario Calculator, it's really not all that hard to figure out how. This one's cool, it's fine, it's a fucking calculator. And that's all of them, I hope. This was quite the trip down memory lane for me as I grew up with so many of these games on my family's first Packard Bell computer, as well as the PCs at school, most of which still, at the time, were using the gigantic original floppy disks. You know, the ones that were actually floppy. Surprisingly, I think I actually did learn a lot from educational games growing up, but unfortunately, they were never any of these. They were all proper educational IPs built from the ground up to be educational games, like literally any of the Learning Company games, for example. Those are honestly all quality products that were just as good at being fun experiences as they were at teaching. Unfortunately, this doesn't apply to most of the licensed edutainment games though, and that's where the majority of these Mario games lie. They rested so much on the laurels of Mario as a character that they didn't think they needed to actually make an engaging game, much less one that can actually truly teach you anything. I feel like if your IP starts out as an educational franchise, you have something to prove to kids, to give them a reason to want to play your game, despite it being school in disguise. With Mario and other various licensed educational games, though, it's as if they thought all they needed was the name, and that's just not how it works. Now, obviously, a couple of the games on here are the exception. Mario Paint is obviously a good game, but it was also not designed to be specifically an educational game, and it was also developed by Nintendo. There may be a couple outliers here, but after taking a dive into all these educational games, there's at least one thing I did learn, and that's that nearly all of these belong in the garbage. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it and you want to see more, there's a couple other videos on the screen right there you can click on. And if you want to see everything I upload, subscribe and then tap the bell icon to be notified when I upload. And if you want to help support the channel, I also have a Patreon right there too.